I have here two old favorites, both by Psikyo, both for the Dreamcast. And both of them have some similarities gameplay-wise. Yep, for this week I decided to do a couple games I was actually a bit nostalgic about because they bring me back to my college years in the late 90s, early 2000s. Yes, back in the days when arcades weren't quite dead yet. They were just mostly dead. So these two games actually ran on Naomi hardware in the arcade, and for those not in the know, that's basically an arcade Dreamcast. So what you have here are pretty much one-to-one ports for the home. Both games are fairly unknown these days, and I felt like they could use a little bit more love. So, without further ado, let's dive right into Cannon Spike. Hey, who could that be? Yes, Cannon Spike is fan service pretty much in every way possible. And I'd expect nothing less from a game named after one of Cammy's Street Fighter moves. Which isn't to say that it's a bad game, in fact quite the opposite. Cannon Spike plays very well. Although regrettably it's not a twin-stick shooter. However, Cannon Spike uses every button on the controller, which in terms of strategy does go a long way towards making up for it. So here's what you've got in your arsenal. You've got a melee attack, a ranged attack, and then powerful versions of either of those. In addition to that, you have a bomb and a lock-on. The lock-on does let you strafe to some degree, although you can only lock on to enemies for a period of time. So take all those moves, combine it with high-speed action, lots of bosses, a just out-of-control breakneck pace, and you've really got something unique here. As far as arena shooters go, it's really a breath of fresh air compared with all the Robotron knockoffs out there. And it really shows what kind of different things you could do if you stray from the Smash TV or Geometry Wars formulas. Although short, the game really does not reuse enemies a whole lot. In fact, you can expect every level to bring something a little bit different. They made some other really smart decisions when they made this game. For instance, when you're knocked down, you get to roll out of the way. That allows you to gain some distance between you and the enemy immediately. The game also lets you combo enemies. For example, you can throw a few punches and then pull out a ranged attack. You also have to be somewhat selective and decide whether you want to pull out the lock-on or strafe normally. But even with all the thought put into the controls, I never really stopped missing the controls that would be offered by a dual analog setup. It's been a long time, but I remember having a similar beef with Neo Contra on the PS2. But I really do think it's a fair trade-off. I would much rather have the selection of weapons available to my characters than pinpoint aiming. Now, I do have a problem with some of the game's balance. Although a lot of players newer to shoot 'em ups might really appreciate it, I kind of don't like that it has a life bar because I think it leans on it a little bit too much. Some of the patterns are extremely hard to avoid and you will take damage. The game tries to make up for it by giving you quite a bit of life and frequent health ups, but it's never quite as tight as a shoot 'em up game where you only have 3 lives. All that said, I think this makes the game a lot less frustrating for a newer player. This also means that you can play 2-player mode with a much less experienced player and let them have all the health power-ups. Yep, Cannon Spike makes for a fantastic 2-player game. So I really do recommend Cannon Spike. It's not flawless, but I feel like it's different enough to stand out from the horde of arena shoot 'em ups. Like Cannon Spike, Zero Gunner 2 is difficult to classify. In some respects, it feels like a follow-up to Cannon Spike, especially given that Zero Gunner 1 was much more of a traditional shoot-'em-up game. Or you could also argue that Zero Gunner 2 is simply Zero Gunner 1, except the whole game plays like the boss battles. I generally think that Zero Gunner 2 is pretty much halfway between Zero Gunner and Cannon Spike. I'd previously reviewed Under Defeat on the Dreamcast, another helicopter shoot-'em-up game, but these play nothing alike. For one, in Zero Gunner 2 you can swivel a full 360 degrees. And that's where the Cannon Spike comparisons come in, because the game plays almost like a scrolling arena shooter. And the level designs take full advantage of the fact that you can swivel in any direction. In fact, it's a game where you really want to stay near the middle of the screen if you can. This is partly because of the way the swiveling works. See, when you hit B, a little cursor appears some distance in front of your craft. This is your pivot point. You can circle strafe around that point, or you can whip your chopper around 180 degrees by crossing that point. It's a brilliant control scheme that feels appropriately helicopter-y. Where in Cannon Spike I lamented the lack of aiming, in this game I would miss this system. I mean, imagine if you could face any angle instantly. It would no longer feel like you're in a helicopter. Not only that, but the game uses the fact that you need space in order to turn to try and corner and trap you. Control and level design fit together almost perfectly in Zero Gunner 2. Almost. A somewhat minor gripe that I have is that the bigger enemies do not respond to your position on screen. Everything is very tightly scripted, and while this might make a lot of sense in a shoot-'em-up that primarily scrolls at one angle, for example a game that's always scrolling up or always scrolling to the right, it makes a lot less sense in Zero Gunner 2 where you can face any direction. So sometimes you have a boss who's facing away from you and firing madly, and it just feels a bit goofy, like the boss is blind or something. If Zero Gunner 2 had at least some of the enemies react to your position on screen more, it might really make it feel more cohesive. But putting that minor nitpick aside, Zero Gunner 2 is an excellent game. All things considered, I think it's a better game than Cannon Spike, even though you can't play as Mega Man or Cammy. You do have 3 different helicopters to choose from, each with their own special abilities. Some of them have more powerful specials, some of them have specials that recharge much faster, and you recharge the specials by getting those floating E symbols. The E power-ups also add a couple more layers to the gameplay because they get sucked towards your chopper only if you stop firing for a second. Not only that, but when your specials gauge is full all the way, each E collected adds a lot more to your score. And I love how the E power-ups drift around as if they're being blown by the wind, and then get sucked into your rotors. There are some other neat touches too. For instance, every boss pretty much transforms into a giant mech. And if you've ever played anything else by Psikyo, this is not entirely unexpected. They also did Gunbird and Strikers. Both those series are pretty much cult favorites in the shmup scene, and they both have the same gimmick. I guess it's kind of like a director's trademark. Unfortunately, Psikyo, like pretty much every other shmup company, has since gone out of business, so I guess you have to take your giant bomber transforming into mechs where you can find them. And while the enemies are quite cool in Zero Gunner 2, they're not exactly flawless. There's one thing in Psikyo games that repeatedly bugs me, and that's lasers like this, which are instant and have no warm-up time whatsoever. Fortunately, the majority of lasers in the game are well behaved and have ample warm-up time. Okay, well that's Cannon Spike and Zero Gunner 2, and whichever one you prefer is largely going to be a matter of taste. Which style of game you prefer, if you're more into shmups, if you're more into arena shooters, if you can't live without a game where you play as Mega Man blowing the crap out of robots. Well, I guess that's what Mega Man does in all his games, but you know what I mean. Unfortunately, both these games are pretty expensive these days, although if you look at collector forums, you really might be able to find a much better deal than you can on an auction site like eBay. And really, you can't go too wrong with either of these.